Hello, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, we're going to be mastering another track in the MPC. Again, it's a track that I originally mastered in my mastering studio for a client. It's another track by Shaggy Manatee, one of my longtime clients, kind of instrumental hip hop type track. Really, really nice track. Let's jump in. Okay, so as I said, it's a track that I've already mastered in my mastering studio for the client. We'll just have a quick listen. If you've seen my video on my mastering template, you'll see how I have it set up. I basically have the PreMaster on one of the audio tracks. Then I have several reference tracks where I can place tracks that I want to reference to. In this particular case, I'm using the actual master that I did for the client as the reference track. So we'll just play that quickly so that you can hear that track in a finished mastered state. So as you can hear, instrumental hip hop type track. I love Shaggy Manatee stuff. I love working with it. So the PreMaster, actually let's just take that off solo. The PreMaster, I'm just going to take all of the effects off. Let's just have a quick listen to the PreMaster. Obviously there's going to be a jump in volume. So when I made the initial assessment, I didn't really see anything wrong with the mix, nothing that really poked out. I always spend a bit of time assessing the tracks that I'm going to master. I felt that perhaps I needed to do a bit of work on the low ends just to tighten it up a little bit. It was a little bit muddy and I felt that it needed kind of crispying up a little bit. I needed to make the transients a little bit punchier and obviously increase the volume as well. So I have attempted to do that in the MPC. As I have explained before, you're obviously limited in the MPC. I always have trouble saying that word, obviously. You're obviously limited in the MPC. So I use 4 slots on the actual PreMaster track, and then I send it to Submix 1, where I use a further 4 slots, obviously. So starting off on the PreMaster, what I always do is I do some surgical EQ. And I'll show you what I've done here with that. So as it's surgical EQ, it's attenuation rather than boosting. And really all that I've done initially is I have rolled off the low end completely, so there's nothing in the sub area. And that is actually all. I haven't actually touched the mud or anything yet. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but you have to bear in mind that any surgical EQ that you do right at the start of a master is then going to affect everything that you do after it. So on this occasion, I decided that I didn't want to touch the mud until later on when I do what I call the color EQ, which comes much later on in the mastering chain. So the next bit of work that I did was the Airsoft clipper, and here is where I was basically looking to reduce the dynamic range of the actual track, and here is where I actually get quite a lot of volume. Please pay no mind to the preset that's at the top here. I completely changed things. That's just a preset that loads up when you load up Airsoft clipper. And no matter how many times I've tried to save my own initial preset to load, when I actually load it, it just defaults back to that. I have no idea why. Perhaps Akai could let me know at some point why you can't save your own init files for presets. Or sometimes you can on some plugins, but sometimes you can't. Anyway, it's not a big deal. It just means I have to zero everything when I start. But I know what I need to zero. So I've used the tan, which if you've watched my previous videos on the Airsoft clipper, it's kind of a hard clipping type algorithm. And I've got a little bit of volume here. I've turned the release on now. I've got the release quite quick because what I in effect wanted to do was I did actually want to reduce the dynamic range, but also just kind of soften things a little bit because I want to harden them up a little bit after this with some compression, and I'll explain that in a second. Quite a bit of drive, anti-alias on, stereo link on. I leave those on by default, Airsoft Clipper. I've explained that in my video about the Airsoft Clipper, and I don't use True Peak in the Airsoft Clipper because I don't like what it does to the sound. It really rounds things off and makes it really obvious. I want the Airsoft Clipper to be quite transparent, although as I said in this case, I have actually got quite a fast release, so I am in effect slightly adjusting the transients of the snare drums. But this is where I've got a lot of my volume from, but you can see it's not doing an amazing amount, but the PreMaster is actually quite dynamic, so I did want to reduce the dynamic range. You can hear that the snare drums are just a tiny little bit softer, but obviously the dynamic range has reduced. It's very difficult to do before and after with the MPC because there isn't any auto gain, and it's just difficult to do it. So I do apologise. I know some people go absolutely mental judging by some of the comments I see online if there is an auto gain. Let me just tell you something, and I'm sorry if this upsets you, but auto gain is something that is quite recent, and it's something that people who have been mixing or making music, etc., we had to do without that for a long time. So consider auto gain to be a bit of a luxury, and it's something that we've just got used to. If you've been mixing for a long time, you didn't have that, so you got used to not having it. So it's really nice to have it now, but I just want to point out that it's not something that's always been around, and it's a bit of a luxury. So I'm sorry if there's no auto gain, and I'm sorry that the levels aren't matched. Just to save you commenting below, there's no auto gain, which does happen quite frequently. So moving on, what I decided I wanted to do next is because I've reduced the dynamic range and in effect very slightly rolling off the snare drums, but I did have a reason behind that. I wanted to bring back some punchiness in using compression. You can use something like a Transient Designer, but the Transient Designer in the MPC, whilst it is fairly decent, I don't consider it to be kind of a mastering level Transient Designer. At a lower level, when you're mixing, you want to change the transients of snare drums or hi-hats or kicks or anything like that, it's good. But for a full track, I don't want to say mastering grade because that's a marketing phrase that I don't really like it, to be honest. It fools people into buying things because they say these are mastering grade converters or this is a mastering grade EQ. It's a marketing thing. So I don't like to use the word. It's like cinematic, you know, whatever. Moving on, the Transient Designer I don't consider to be of a good enough quality to use on a master. That's the best way to put it. So I'm going to be using compression, and for that I just used Air Compressor. Now, as you can see, it's doing a minimal amount, but with the longer attack and the short release, fairly low ratio, but you don't tend to use high ratios for mastering anyway. But what it's doing is just adding a tiny amount of punchiness to the snare drum. I did it in a different way in the actual master, but the plugin that I used in the actual master for the client, you don't have that kind of plugin in the MPC, so I couldn't actually do it. It's a plugin called Split EQ where you can isolate certain frequencies and transient design those particular frequencies. You can do it in the MPC, and I've kind of done a video on it on a multi-band compressor. You can build a multi-band compressor in the MPC, but it didn't need that much work. So I felt that just using the compressor in this case was going to be enough. So now we're moving on to the slots that are in the submix, and here's where I did my color EQ. Now I've added some low end, kind of around about where the fundament of the kick is, but not super low end, so I'm not bringing up the subs that I've already tried to get rid of with the surgical EQ right at the start. Here's where I've cleared up a bit of mud. You can see that it's around about 200 Hertz, 211 Hertz in this case. and a little bit of crispiness or clarity, as I quite often say, at 4.3. That can be anywhere between 4 to 6, but generally it's sort of the higher end of 4, lower end of 5 generally. And then a bit of brightness up top, quite a lot of brightness up top actually. Again, it's a shelf, 8K, the exciting frequency, and just kind of brightens everything up. Where you can probably notice it the most is the snare drum, the higher mids of the snare drum, and the hi-hats, and it does kind of open the track up a little bit as well. Let's just go bypass again. I'll play it through a few times just so your ears get used to it, and then I'll turn the EQ on. To me, it just gives everything a bit of crispiness. It's not hi-fi, just a little bit of bite. And talking of bite, tube drive. I'm going to put the limiter on at this point as well. Tube drive, if you've watched any of my videos, I absolutely love this plugin. I want to do a video on tube drive showing how I use tube drive, but I feel that it would just be a 10-minute video of me just saying how much I love it, because I do love it that much. It's such a simple plugin, but it can do so much if you use it in the correct way. Here you can see it's super subtle, but the flavor that it gives the master, the flavor that you can give to tracks, the secret sauce, the mojo, whatever you want to call it, it just really adds something, and I absolutely love it. I can't, honestly, perhaps it would be a 10-minute video of just, I get a t-shirt made and a hat made with just tube drive written on it. Air tube drive. Anyway, where was I? Right, yeah, so we'll be in bypass, and then what I'll do is I'll drop it in. There's a little bit of drive, a little bit of saturation, and it really brings out the mids and the high mids, adds a little bit of bite and grittiness. I don't want to say hi-fi because I don't, you know, we didn't particularly want a hi-fi sound, the original artist and myself, on these masters, but it did just kind of give it some crunch and adds a little bit of character to it. So bypass first. Where you notice it the most is the crunch of the snare drum. Again, in the assessment of the track, you quite often decide what are the main elements of the track. No, not necessarily main, I'm not sure that's the right word, but the dominant elements of a track. Do they need to be tamed? Do they need to be brought forward? Do they need to, do you need to highlight them? Or, you know, do they need to be tamed, like I said? So it's quite a snare heavy track, and that is the case with quite a lot of boom bap and lo-fi hip hop. You know, that kind of peak rock snare that just drives all the way through the track. So I wanted to keep that dominant but tame it a little bit, which I did earlier on, and then this tube drive just kind of brings out the not only the transient, the initial hit of the snare drum, but it also brings up the sustain of the snare drum a little bit as well, because there's a lovely natural reverb on it as well, which probably comes from the original studio that the snare was recorded in. So we'll come out again, just listen to the crispiness and the bite of the snare drum when I drop the tube drive in. I'll actually push the drive a little bit as well so you can hear. To me, it just makes the track, come alive. Wrong one, sorry. It makes the track come alive. It just goes from being to being yes. That's how I think of it. It's quite emotional. I'm emotional about Air Tube Drive. I love it that much. So, and then finally with the limiter, little bit of look ahead. Take the ceiling down to 0.2. I've monoed the low end. I tend to do that in the limiter. There are several plugs that you can do that in the MPC, but I tend to do it in the limiter. It kind of has the best results for me. Doesn't seem to create any kind of phasing issues or anything. I've actually brought it down a little bit. I'd got enough volume from the track throughout using tube drive and using the airsoft clipper. Release at about 75. I started finding that if I went a bit lower than that, I was starting to get a tiny little bit of distortion, and I didn't really want the distortion in this particular case. That's not, you know, the distortion can be a really, really good thing sometimes. In this case, I didn't really want it. There was already enough grit and dirt, etc., in the track, so I didn't feel that I needed it. And also, sometimes the distortion you get off limiters is not a particularly pleasant distortion. I wouldn't, as a rule, if I wanted to imprint distortion in a track, I wouldn't, as a rule, use a limiter to do that. Really, the limiter is there for me to get a little bit more volume and make sure that I'm not getting any peaks or any overs, as you would call it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to solo the original master that I did for the client in the studio and compare it in and out of solo. It's going to compare to what I've just done in the MPC. So we'll start with the So it's pretty close. I can hear a few minor differences. I think because my ears are tuned to the equipment that I use in my mastering studio, I hear certain characteristics, especially in the low end. When I've been doing these comparison masters in the MPCs, the one thing that I notice almost every single time is the low end is kind of about 60 hertz to 110 hertz. There's a warmth and beefiness that I have in the studio that I can't quite get out of the MPC. I'm still working on it, and I'm not saying it can't. I'm not saying that it can't be done, as I'm sure it can, but I haven't quite got there myself personally yet. So it is pretty close. It sounds a bit cleaner what I've done in the MPC compared to what I did in the studio. The studio's got a little bit more warmth and I don't want to say analog, earthy organicness to it. I make up these words. I think there should be a mastering dictionary with these words in, these descriptive words. Organic-y, earthness. Anyway, so yeah, we'll play out and I'll compare them. But for me, I'm really happy with the master that I've done in the MPC of this particular track, actually. It's got a really, really nice sound to it. And I think if the client was looking to press to vinyl, I would seriously consider using the MPC master to cut to vinyl, because for me, the low end is a little bit more controlled. However, the actual master that I did for the client, for me, it's just got way more beef and just sounds just got a little bit more in the bottom end. And I think it was fitting more with the other tracks. You have to understand that in context with the other tracks I mastered for the client at that time, it was in context, it fitted in with the other tracks. And that's something that you have to do as a mastering engineer quite often, is especially if you're working on albums or EPs, you do want some kind of fluidity, some kind of cohesiveness for all of the tracks together to work well. You don't really want them to sound all completely different if they are of the same kind of genre. Not very often anyway. You know, generally you want a sound that runs throughout. If you take something like Radiohead albums, I quite often use them as an example. There's multiple genres on Radiohead albums, from rock to electronic to ballad. I say Tom York does ballads, but slower songs, I guess. But yet there's a sound that they have throughout the LP because of the way that it was mastered. And that is the job of a mastering engineer a lot of the time, is to get that kind of same sound throughout. So yeah, I'm really, really happy with how this master's turned out, actually. And we'll play out with doing comparisons. So we'll start with the original master I did for the client, and then I'll switch to the MPC version.